So I watched a lot of Sesame Street when I was a kid. Basically every afternoon in the 70s, you'd find me sitting cross-legged in front of our TV, singing along with the Muppets and Luis and Maria and Gordon on their front stoop. The Pointer Sisters taught me how to count with the world's most awesome pinball cartoon. Luis taught me to sing a song in English and in Spanish, which I was really proud of. As we all know, Sesame Street had a multi-ethnic cast. Americans of every skin color you can think of. And for a while, I kind of thought this was what the world would be like. All these people with different cultures hanging out, learning their vowels together, singing songs with these groovy monsters.
What's the last one?
I don't know.
One!
Yeah, one, yeah!
Of course, eventually I outgrew Sesame Street, and the multi-ethnic programming on TV pretty much came to an end. We only had 5 channels in those days. It was basically Super Friends or Three's Company. So I started spending my afternoons watching white superheroes fly around, rescuing people. And the world started presenting itself to me in a way that looked increasingly white. We're going to talk more about Sesame Street and these white superheroes, because I think they help illuminate the most important piece of the puzzle surrounding the attack on the Capitol. The one I've been looking for this whole time. But first, I need to tell you about the Trumpian Octopus, which is how I think about all these different factions that Donald Trump pulled together in DC last January 6th. Like a big octopus with 4 main tentacles: evangelicals, white nationalists, QAnon followers, and, quote, normals. I need to tell you about the insane combination of propaganda, technology, and social media that Trump used on that freezing winter day to incite thousands of his followers into a sea of deadly rage. One that would ultimately be connected with 7 deaths and about 140 injured police officers. And finally, because this is our last episode of The Control Variable for the season, we're going to talk, seriously, about how to stop it.
Hey, listen, before we launch into this, I did want to ask you a couple of things. So, one of the issues that we've been finding over the last few years with journalists is, and we'll just have a very straightforward conversation, is a lack of integrity, not always putting what people are saying in context.
That's Priscilla. She and her husband, Kevin, are big Trump supporters. They're from Texas. Evangelical Christians. They were there at the protest last January 6th. But although they participated in the march to the Capitol, I need to make clear that they didn't enter the building itself or commit any violence. They agreed to talk to me because they think things have gotten out of hand between conservatives and progressives in America. They think we need to start talking. But they're also pretty wary of the mainstream media.
It's more just due diligence because of what we see, because it's just such a bad problem out there. We're open to having a dialogue with somebody that has a totally contrary opinion to maybe what we have. So we're good with that. I think that's good, to have those good conversations. That's part of the problem.
Spend 10 minutes talking to Kevin and Priscilla, and it becomes clear that we have really different ideas about what constitutes a fact. But it's also clear that they think the liberal media hates them, has no respect for them at all, thinks of them as a joke. Anyway, Kevin's a fan of QAnon. Priscilla's not. They say they went to the Capitol on January 6th because Trump asked them to come support him on Twitter. We've all seen these tweets. The one from December 19th where Trump says, "Be there, we'll be wild." The one from January 1st where he announces a big protest rally in DC will take place on the 6th and starts calling it Stop the Steal.
We will stop the steal.
To Kevin and Priscilla, it was obvious that Joe Biden had stolen the election. Trump had been predicting it on Twitter for months, saying the only way he could lose was if the election was rigged. So when Trump announced that the steal had happened, they felt like they had to take action.
I wanted to go because my president, probably the last real president we'll have, said, "Come on and show your support." And I'm telling you, 2.5 million people were there.
Right. So the New York Times recently estimated that as many as 10,000 people marched on the Capitol that day. And Newsweek reported classified numbers from the Secret Service and the FBI estimating that up to 120,000 may have been at the mall. But even 120,000 is a long way away from millions.
The reason, in my opinion, you had over 1 million people there, which the press doesn't like to report at all because it shows too much activity, too much spirit and faith and love. There was such love at that rally. You had over 1 million people there.
But from the beginning, Donald Trump has been really good at seducing his followers with lies and exaggeration, like all cult leaders. Presenting himself as this larger-than-life Superman, gold-plated and triumphant, zipping around the globe in his Trump jet, boasting about his billions, riding down his golden escalator to address his fans. And somehow Trump's followers are so into this fantasy that they've decided to believe it's the truth.
We shut Fox News off 6 years ago.
Priscilla says Fox was just out to make money. The only news sources she and Kevin trust now are One American News Network and Twitter. They were both right there at the Capitol steps on January 6th. Priscilla says the mainstream media has it wrong, that the protest wasn't really violent, that most people there were peaceful.
There was a loving crowd, too, by the way. There was a lot of love. I've heard that from everybody. Many, many people have told me that was a loving crowd.
Of course, there were plenty of protesters at the Capitol who weren't violent. It's estimated that about 2,000 people stormed the building and the grounds, so the other 8,000 just hung back and watched. But there's no getting around the footage from the 6th that shows officers engaged in hours of hand-to-hand combat with protesters as they try to force their way into the building. There's no getting around the fact that 7 people died in connection with the attack on January 6th, and over 140 police officers were injured. There's no getting around the fact that a deadly riot took place that day. One incited entirely by a lie. And this lie is so brazen, you can't really talk about it without talking about the original big lie that Hitler describes in Mein Kampf. Remember the original big lie that we talked about in episode 3? The one where Hitler claimed Germany hadn't actually lost World War I after all? That it was all part of a plot by scheming Jews and communists bent on world domination? A giant stab in the back? The key, Hitler wrote, to pulling off this kind of lie was to make sure that it was so outrageous that people literally, quote, would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. So, like, if I told you I'd never Googled myself, you probably wouldn't buy it. But if I told you I'm secretly a dinosaur who hatched from a 2,000-year-old egg in the Mojave Desert, you might. I'm Kim Cutter, and I promise you I'm not a dinosaur. But I am your host for The Control Variable, Episode 5. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. So from his earliest days as a politician, Donald Trump was eerily good at communicating with his followers on Twitter. He was brash and outspoken, charismatic, a bully in that taunting, comical way that went over big in high school, calling Jeb Bush dumb as a rock, promising to sue John Kasich just for fun, tweeting that, quote, an extremely credible source told him Obama's birth certificate was a fraud. But Trump wasn't just blunt. He was also really good at creating these insinuating tweets that implied bigotry without actually stating it outright. So instead of posting an openly racist comment during the Minneapolis riots that followed the death of George Floyd, Trump tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Instead of hurling direct hate speech at 4 newly elected Democratic congresswomen of color in 2019, Trump tweeted that they were, quote, free to leave the country, and accused them of hating America.
Our country is in serious trouble. We don't have victories anymore. When do we beat Mexico at the border? They're laughing at us, at our stupidity. The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems.
Trump knows white America has a wound, a big one. And he exploited that wound pretty brilliantly with his campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," which he tweeted for the first time in January of 2012. With that one line, Trump managed to both insult and inspire his followers, telling them that yes, they were losers now, but that they could all become winners again and reclaim America's former glory if they just elected him president. This is what NYU professor of psychology Jay Van Bavel calls Trump's, quote, rhetoric of collective victimization. It's one of Trump's most powerful weapons.
You know, before the 2016 election, my lab, led by one of my students at the time, Billy Brady, analyzed a full year of the posts from every political leader, every national political leader's Twitter account. So Trump and Hillary Clinton, every single senator, every single member of Congress in the House. And what we found is that one of the things, the rhetoric that Trump used that seemed to go the most viral for him was when he used rhetoric around collective victimization, right, that we are being victimized. And so this has been part of his toolbox that he leveraged in his rise to success. As you might recall, he was outspent by Hillary Clinton by about $500 million in that election. And his very first interview when he became president was on 60 Minutes. And he said that social media gave him the advantage that he was able to overcome this spending gap.
MAGA and the rhetoric Trump spun around it told Americans that others were to blame for their country's troubles, primarily illegal immigrants and greedy liberal elites like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. MAGA shamed white Americans, wounding their pride by telling them that their country was washed up, a has-been. Then it reinflated their pride by promising that if they just elected Trump president, he'd restore America to the winner's podium by creating millions of jobs, lowering taxes, building a wall, kicking out illegals, locking up crooked Hillary, and removing the environmental restrictions he claimed were strangling America's businesses.
We have made America wealthy again. We have made America strong again. We have made America proud again.
Etc., etc. Basically, Trump was telling people he had a time machine, one that would take them all back to the Reagan 80s, back to the days when white Americans were more secure and had a lot more power. Trump was a fast learner, and he had no problem changing his messaging to please his fans. Like, it turns out Trump didn't even like the slogan "Drain the Swamp" initially. It was only after he saw how crazy his followers were about it that he started using it.
You know, I said to somebody the other day, and even today, drain the swamp. We put it in about 2 days ago. I said, drain the swamp. I didn't like it. I didn't like the expression, drain the swamp in Washington. So I said it 3 days ago. The place went crazy. I said, you know what? I'm starting to like that expression. And now it's it's like trending all over the world. Drain the swamp in Washington. So we like that expression.
In the 3 weeks before the 2016 election, Donald Trump tweeted "Drain the Swamp" 79 times. And though Trump initially claimed he'd stopped tweeting after he assumed the presidency in 2017, he ended up tweeting more than 25,000 times during his time in the White House, basically using Twitter like a virtual palace balcony where he addressed his followers daily, announcing policy changes on Twitter, firing staff members on Twitter, threatening to annihilate North Korea on Twitter. And as crazy as these tweets were, they gave Trump a lot of power, like an unprecedented amount. Instead of submitting himself to press conferences and interviews with journalists from the, quote, fake news media, Trump was able to spread his own propaganda and totally dominate the news cycle at the exact same time. The Western world hung on his every tweet. And just when you tell yourself that it was ridiculous, that there was no point in paying attention to this toxic buffoon's rants, you'd remember that he was also the leader of the free world, the guy with the nuclear codes. And ignoring him would start to seem like a really bad idea. So Twitter kind of single-handedly enabled Trump to turn the presidency into a cult of personality, one where he made the rules, he decided what was true, and if you didn't like it, you'd very soon find yourself roasted in the Twitter sphere. Then, in 2020, Trump started using Twitter to push a new conspiracy. When the polls showed that Trump was likely to lose the presidential election to Joe Biden, he started tweeting regular warnings that the election would be stolen, saying the only way he could lose was if Democrats rigged the vote. From April until Election Day in November, Trump tweeted regularly that mail-in voting was going to lead to massive voter fraud, that the 2020 election would be, quote, the greatest rigged election in history. And again, I had to point out that there was no basis for these claims.
It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose. But this is big stuff. This is stealing millions of votes. Because the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. We're going to win this election. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election. That's right. We're going to win this election.
On November 3rd, 2020, the American people elected Joe Biden president. On November 4th, a group called Stop the Steal appeared on Facebook and quickly racked up more than 360,000 members, at which point the site shut it down. But the ball was already rolling. A torrent of new groups appeared on Facebook in the days that followed, spreading the same message and continuing to incite and unite Trump's followers. And by the time Facebook had removed these groups, it was too late. They'd already amassed 2.5 million members and sent wildfires of disinformation blazing across the internet.
Traditionally, when we think of propaganda as being this thing that only gets spread by super powerful political actors. Propaganda that occurred surrounding January the 6th was both top-down and bottom-up.
That's Dr. Sam Woolley. He's the program director of the propaganda research team at UT Austin. He specializes in emerging technology and manipulation.
We saw surrogates of Donald Trump spreading propaganda using social media about coming together to protest what they called a stolen election falsely. Mm-hmm. You had a lot of other groups in a very sort of non-monolithic fashion gathering together and also organizing and communicating using these platforms.
This is what Woolley calls splintered propaganda. It pulled together groups ranging from evangelical Christians to pro-Trump activists and right-wing media outlets to neo-fascist paramilitary groups like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters, to QAnon followers, to curious suburban conservatives, or, quote, normals. According to media insights company Signal Labs, the term storm the Capitol was mentioned 100,000 times on social media in the month leading up to January 6th. And here I need to point out that a lot of these urgings appeared in viral tweet threads that also featured detailed discussions of how the Capitol building might be breached. And the rest, as they say, is history.
And breaking news tonight, the deadly siege on Congress as an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol.
Chaos at the Capitol. A mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, breaking windows.
Spotted protesters are inside the Capitol building. There are scores of protesters.
In response to the attack, the Department of Justice launched the largest criminal investigation in American history. At the time of this recording, more than 725 people have been charged with crimes connected to January 6th. 225 of them were charged with assault or resisting arrest. More than 75 were charged with using a deadly or dangerous weapon against police officers. 11 have been charged with sedition, which the Federal Criminal Code defines as, quote, the attempt to overthrow, put down, or to destroy by force the government of the United States. And here's where things get crazy, because it turns out that only about 13% of the people charged in connection with January 6th are thought to have any ties to extremist or fringe organizations like QAnon, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, or the Three Percenters. Which means, and stay with me here, that the overwhelming majority of people who breached the Capitol that day, 87%, don't appear to have any connections to extremist groups at all. They're normals. And over half of those normals have been identified as business owners or CEOs from white-collar occupations, or doctors, or lawyers, or architects. Experts say this means extremist ideologies are increasingly moving into the mainstream. And maybe this is true. But what if it's not true? What if those ideologies have been buried there the whole time? So we're going to talk more about this. But for now, let's just be clear that the Trumpian Octopus has its tentacles far and deep in the American electorate. 74 million Americans voted for Trump in 2020. Almost 80% of them believe Trump won. And mind you, these numbers are from a year later, not hot on the heels of the loss. They're based entirely on Trump's unsubstantiated claims of a stolen election. They're undeterred by the fact that even Trump's own Justice Department proclaimed the election free and fair. And maybe most distressingly, 54% of those Trump voters now say they'd tolerate a military coup. By planting the seed that the election was wrongfully stolen from him, Trump has effectively created a constitutional crisis in which any outcome is possible. even the end of American democracy. So now we need to talk about algorithms, specifically social media algorithms, because they play a really important part in this whole thing. Without them, January 6th couldn't have happened. It's like this. When we go on Facebook, the news we see appears to be objective, but it's actually not at all. Thanks to Facebook's algorithms, the content we see there is carefully and precisely tailored to our personal preferences and convictions, based on our previous visits.
What the agents of influence using the internet wanted to do is identify what are the hot button topics we can get people to support Trump. So whether it's, anti-abortion rights or gun rights or white identity, or they're part of the Koch empire and they have fossil fuels and they want to continue to stir up like there's no such thing as human influence in global climate change.
This is cult deprogrammer and author of The Cult of Trump, Stephen Hassan. He points out that thanks to social media algorithms, the Trump campaign was able to custom tailor its messaging to the specific interests of target groups, demographics, and individuals.
This is a movement like we've never seen in the history of our country.
Addressing the issues that were most likely to decide who they voted for.
And that's what this fight is all about. We're taking on the failed political establishment and restoring government of, by, and for the people. It's the people. You're the people. You won the election.
It's like a very intense version of niche marketing.
What we're living in now, there's so much data. There's over 5,000 data points collected on every voting American, so that AI algorithms can predict what you're going to do better than your spouse can predict what you're going to do. If somebody wants to get you, they will find which buttons to push in what sequence to incrementally move you to where they want you to be.
This idea that social media algorithms dictate the information that shows up in our feeds based on what issues engage us the most kind of disturbs me more than anything else. It means we're literally building echo chambers around ourselves every time we go near social media, right? The algorithm takes note of everything I click on and then feeds me more of the same. So the more I click, the more I end up surrounding myself with videos and articles and information that basically just tell me the same thing over and over again. So if I'm a Trump voter in November of 2020 and I'm hearing Trump's claim that the election's been stolen from him, and I decide to go do some research on social media and see what I can find out, the platform's algorithm is already going to know that I'm a Trump voter, and is therefore going to feed me the kinds of articles that other Trump voters are responding to the most, which of course are overwhelmingly articles supporting Trump's claim that the election was stolen. So even if I want to hear another perspective, it's highly unlikely that Twitter or Facebook or Google or YouTube is going to send one my way. Because what the algorithm wants, above all, is to feed me the kind of content that I'm most likely to engage with, the content that will keep me scrolling on the site the longest, so I'll end up seeing the highest number of ads. In the days immediately after the attack on the Capitol, social media platforms did finally start to take action against Trump. Facebook and Instagram barred Trump for 2 years, through January 2023, for inciting violence. Twitter and YouTube have suspended his accounts permanently. Twitter also deleted 70,000 accounts linked to QAnon. But the spread of propaganda and misinformation on social media sites continues, and probably will continue as long as the Twitters and Facebooks of this world make money by monetizing our attention. Because, as a study from the MIT Media Lab found, nothing drives online traffic like lies do. They spread farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information, especially in politics. Turns out misinformation is good for business. Let's be clear. The Trump voter who goes on Twitter to find out about the election Trump says has been stolen is basically guaranteed to receive a whole bunch of false information claiming the election has indeed been stolen. So instead of informing the Trump voter about anything, those articles will just confirm, echo, and ultimately stoke the outrage the Trump voter already feels. making the Trump voter feel that horrendous injustice has been perpetrated, and that the only hope they have of keeping their country from disaster is to head to Washington, join up with other, quote, resistors, and try to stage a coup. So what are we supposed to do about this? I put the question to Sam Woolley at UT Austin. Woolley's writing a book right now called Manufacturing Consensus. It's a riff on Noam Chomsky's famous book, Manufacturing Consent, which came out in the 80s.
We understood then in the 1980s and when they republished it in the early 2000s that the media, particularly news journalism, was being controlled by powerful interests. And there was questions about like who those interests were and how they controlled the media.
Woolley's book is based on the premise that the media we use have changed, but that the interests behind them haven't.
There's lots of people who could understand what the algorithms are prioritizing. It's just that we have no access to that information. And it's constantly considered a trade secret. And it's basically glossed over by the social media companies. We can't share that with you because it's proprietary. And if we did, it would ruin our businesses.
There's a growing call for what's called algorithmic transparency, which would basically force companies to make the decision-making process behind their algorithms visible and open to the public. And Woolley's all in favor of this. But unsurprisingly, big tech is not. They want to protect their secrets at all costs. To the extent that 7 of the biggest tech companies spent $135 million in the last 2 years alone lobbying Washington lawmakers. And Woolley says lobbying isn't the only obstacle here. The lawmakers themselves present a problem too.
The problem is a lot of them, I would say 99% of them don't understand how Twitter works, so how Facebook works.
And as essential as it is to rein in social media by making algorithms transparent and fact-checking tweets and posts, Woolley doesn't think it's going to be enough to heal our divisions. He says these measures are really just a band-aid, that the real problems go deeper. He says our two-party system encourages people to see America in terms of us and them, which leaves us vulnerable to tyrants like Trump. That a healthy democracy isn't really possible without a quality public education system for all, and that everyone needs to have access to voting.
We have to ask ourselves really important questions about why people believe what they believe. And what I ask people is to accept that the people on the right who support Donald Trump or support QAnon believe what they are saying a lot of the time. We can't argue with folks on Facebook in an attempt to dissuade them of conspiracy or propaganda. It doesn't work.
Like the culty programmers I spoke to last episode, Woolley says that no amount of rational explanation is going to breach this divide, that it's going to take something else. So now I have to tell you a story. It's about growing up here in America, after I outgrew Sesame Street. So it's the 70s and 80s, the height of the Cold War. I'm lucky, white, upper middle class, suburban. My parents love me. And as I'm growing up, I learn a story about America. This story is told everywhere. At my public school, on TV, at the movies, in the supermarkets, in malls, in churches and libraries, at sporting events and dinner tables, in magazines, and on the radio.
No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations.
No country's got more good things than we've got, including the world's best drink to help us enjoy.
Shining city upon a hill.
But they had more liberty than any other people on earth.
America is freedom, and freedom is special and rare.
The story is that America is special, the greatest country in the world, land of the free, home of the brave. I can still see the pictures in my history book. The illustrations of eagles and purple mountains, amber waves of grain. And I'm taught that Americans are special too. The strongest and bravest, the most innovative and self-reliant, the most generous, the best. Number one, first to the moon.
Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space.
In history class, I'm taught that the Native Americans willingly sold their land to the Pilgrims back in the 1600s. I'm taught that slavery was bad, but then the Civil War happened, and now everyone is equal. I know this isn't true because white kids and black kids don't really sit together at my school, because some black kids don't have money to buy lunch, and no black families live in my neighborhood. But no one talks about this.
But as long as we remember our first principles and believe in ourselves, the future will always be ours.
And of course, the other thing no one talks about, but that's made clear by the people who star in my history books and in all the movies and magazines and TV shows, is that white Americans are especially special. And especially special are white American men. They're the ones who built everything. The stars of the show. This is the story I grew up with. I think it's the one most white Americans grew up with. It wasn't white nationalism, or Christian nationalism, or Christian extremism. I'm not talking about anything fringe or radical at all. I'm saying that when I was growing up, this was the culture, the mainstream culture, the one we all lived and breathed day in, day out. And unfortunately, it's one a lot of people built their identities around. Of course, it wasn't the only culture, not by a long shot. But this culture was so ubiquitous, so wildly dominant, that we didn't even think of it as a story about America. We thought of it as the story about America, the truth.
An informed patriotism is what we want. And are we doing a good enough job teaching our children what America is and what she represents in the long history of the world? We were taught very directly what it means to be an American. And we absorbed almost in the air a love of country and an appreciation of its institutions.
I love this country. I've lived here all my life. It's my home. And I'm proud of all the great things America's accomplished. But I also know there are a lot of Americans who've been left out of our country's story. People that our promise of liberty and justice is supposed to include, who haven't been included. I know love isn't real unless it can withstand hard, honest conversations. And I think that's what we need to have today. An honest conversation about Donald Trump's supporters. And I think for all the extremists who voted for him, if we really want to know how 74 million Americans voted for Trump in 2020, we can't just point at the cult of QAnon, and the cult of evangelicals, and the cult of the NRA, and the cult of big business. Because while those groups count for a lot of Trump voters, they don't get us anywhere near 74 million. I think to get to 74 million, we need to talk about something that's really hard to talk about, which is the cult of America. Do you remember when I said that every cult starts with a story? I think the cult of America, by which I mean the core culture of America, started with a story of white greatness. And I think that story has been spread, sometimes loudly, sometimes silently, as truth, as fact for 250 years. Now, that cult has taken a serious hit in recent decades. Globalization, jobs shipped overseas, the climate crisis, 9/11, endless wars in the Middle East, rising healthcare costs, widening income inequality. They've made the cult of America more complicated. Wall Street has flourished while Main Street is shutting down. The middle class is dwindling. For the first time in history, white Americans account for less than 60% of the nation. A black man was president. So the face of America is changing. And with it, a very old, very deeply ingrained story is dying out. Psychologists say when it comes to loss, there are 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And I think a lot of Americans are grieving right now. I think a lot of them aren't sure who they are without the story of white American greatness. Without that dream of the brave, strong, free, great white American cowboy riding forever across the prairie. The great white American Superman flying around rescuing people. And though I don't say this as an excuse in any way, if there's one thing I've learned from this investigation, it's that no one can live without a story. Without a story, who are you? This, tragically, is what Donald Trump has tapped into. This fantasy of American exceptionalism. This 250-year-old culturally ingrained belief that white Americans are special. as in more deserving than anyone else, is Trump's core piece of propaganda. It's the story that runs under all his other stories, the source of all his power. And I know I'm not the first person to say this, but I don't think it can be repeated enough right now. This story is how Trump got 74 million votes in 2020, by promising to take us all back in time and make America great again. And if we're not careful, it may be how he gets himself back into the White House in 2024.
That's why the death, if you want to call it that, of American exceptionalism, or the story of American exceptionalism is so unifying to so many people. And that Make America Great Again idea was so unifying to a lot of people, even people that I respect and that I know consider themselves Democrats or liberal, who are, part of the baby boomer generation or the couple generations that came after that. I've heard them sort of espouse in interviews, but also in casual conversation, many of those sorts of talking points about, how the liberals are letting America die and how we're letting China take over the world.
Or as Kevin once said to me,
you want me to take a look at what I hold to be true and flush it down the toilet.
But when it comes to grief, the final stage of acceptance doesn't mean flushing everything you believe down the toilet. It means coming to terms with a new and necessary reality, one that includes everyone. Because I'm pretty sure the only way forward here is together. And at the same time, we white Americans need to recognize, not just say, but understand in our hearts, that people of all races and genders and cultures are special and deserving. And that because our society structures, the bones on which it stands, were not designed in a way that supports that truth, because they were designed by and entirely focused on white men, they need updating, revising. And I don't think any of that is going to be possible until we learn to tell ourselves a new story about America. The Middle Church is based in New York's East Village. Their services are online these days, in part because of COVID, and in part because the church building itself burned down in a terrible fire a little over a year ago, in December of 2020. They're going to rebuild, but for now, everything is online, which means there are people saying welcome from all over when I joined their Sunday service on YouTube one morning in January. My screen fills up with faces of every color, black and white and brown and pink and gold, wrinkled and smooth, shy and open, smiling, serious. An older lady in Japan says welcome in Japanese. A young white guy in Napoleon Dynamite glasses says welcome from the Bronx. A black beaming lady in Ghana says akwaba, which also means welcome. Acoustic guitars start playing as people start signing into the chat. Tom and Bev say good morning from Egg Harbor, Wisconsin. Nicole sends greetings from snowy Charlotte. Sean blazes in from Nashville with a hey y'all and a stream of emojis that includes an American flag, a rainbow, and a flexing bicep, followed by a Star of David and a cross emoji connected by a red heart. I'm not really sure what I'm doing here. I know I'm tired of thinking about all the ways that America is divided and broken, of what's wrong with our country. I know I've heard enough about technology and politics and social media and algorithms for a while. I want to see people, be with people, in a gentle way. I'm here because I want a new story, because I miss singing in church, and because this is the only kind of church I can imagine going to anymore. It's what's called a universalist church. The website describes it as a multicultural, multi-ethnic, intergenerational movement of spirit and justice, powered by revolutionary love, with room for all. The Middle Church is led by Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, a Black minister who says her gospel is love, period. God is love, end of story. She comes on screen, a vision in dreads and bright red lipstick with a breathtaking smile, says, "Welcome home," and the service begins. By coincidence, it's Martin Luther King's birthday, so the service is a celebration in his honor. People in the chat are getting excited. Emojis are flying all over the place. all different color heart emojis and dove emojis and emojis of praying hands.
Come, let us worship God.
I don't know what you come to do.
I come to praise the Lord. I don't know what you come to do. I come to praise the Lord.
I don't know what you come to do.
I come to praise the Lord.
That's the Jerice Johnson Gospel Choir. As they clap and sing, my screen fills up with a grid of smiling faces. Again, in every skin color you can think of. Mostly women, black-haired and blonde-haired and afroed and crew-cut and wavy and silky and braided all over. Everyone's got on a black shirt and a red scarf, but each in their own version. It's the most multiculti thing you've ever seen.
We've really understood that people want to cry and laugh when they get to church. You know, one of my colleagues, Christina, who's in seminary now at ILF, people want to laugh and cry. So you have to move people. The music's got to be badass. The sermons have to be smart and convicting. There has to be joy. And there has to be both mourning and dancing. So we really try to cultivate a space where people can be authentically themselves.
That's Reverend Jackie Lewis. She grew up in Chicago. She says she's been into God for as long as she can remember. Her dad was a deacon in their Presbyterian church when she was a kid. Her mom sang in the choir. Jackie loved the whole thing, the music, the prayers, the communion. She says she knew she was going to spend her life talking about God from early on.
And our church was very child-friendly, sing in the choir, have barn dances in the basement, you know. And then the next year, Dr. King was killed. And when he was killed, now I'm almost 9, a month before my 9th birthday. And I'm traumatized, you know, and activated. I think this guy is all about love and they can kill him. And they did. And it just really zunged me, you know, zinged my brain with how come there's so much hate in the world and why are people so mean to each other? And I did feel then, Kim, that I was going to pick up his mantle. That's a pretty precocious thought for a little girl.
Yeah.
But I thought, I think I'm going to be a drum major for peace.
Jackie went to seminary at Princeton. She started a gospel choir there, studied gender and racial identity development, decided she wanted to build a multi-ethnic community, like MLK did, use it to combat racism and poverty. And at some point, she decided that love belonged at the heart of the whole thing, that in every situation and circumstance, she basically just needed to keep asking, like Tina Turner.
What's love got to do with it? I just began to try to tune in to command to love God with everything and love your neighbor as yourself, and just experience and texts and travel and partners across faith. You just start thinking, God is multilingual. God speaks Buddhist, God speaks Sikh, God speaks Islam, God speaks Zoroastrian, which I don't know exactly what God's saying there, but God does. And I really came all the way home to love God, love neighbor, love self. Everything else is commentary.
So the church is Christian, but in this version of Christianity, all faiths are embraced and celebrated. All genders and sexual orientations and races and ethnicities are welcome, even white guys. Reverend Jackie's actually married to a white guy, so I believe her when she says this.
Teachers, lawyers, moms, dads, some people who really struggle to make ends meet, like really almost carry their house around with them. Some people who are very wealthy, all who are trying to crooked places straight and high places low and democratize our space. We're queer and we're straight and we're Buddhist and Muslim and Jewish and atheists and agnostics come to church because they like the music. It's wild.
A young pastor named Daryl Hamilton comes on and says he loves the song the choir just sang because it reminds him of Negro spirituals sung by slaves as songs of protest and worship, calling for freedom. He says justice is what it means to love out loud. Plays a clip of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Now comes the children's choir. And again, it's kids of all ages and sizes and colors in headphones, singing in their Zoom squares. More congregants pour into the chat. We're at almost 200 now. People from Arizona and South Africa, and Brooklyn and Staten Island, and Miami and Southern California. Mimi says hello from the Pacific Northwest. Neil signs in from South Jersey. The very white, very blonde Reverend Amanda Hambrick Ashcroft, who would not look at all out of place at a Trump rally, comes on and makes announcements about the MLK teach-in that's going to take place that afternoon. The choir sings a rockin' amen. Reverend Jackie comes on and says, "Pray in whatever language or way is comfortable to you." There's more singing. There's protest dancing.
Look at the world that we live in. Look at the trouble and pain. Look out.
And I need to say, there's grief and anger in this service too. 2 hate crimes were committed the night before, and in her sermon, Jackie talks about them. One was anti-Semitic, one anti-Asian. She rages against white supremacy, asks, if all lives really do matter, then tell me, when will the killing end? And at a certain point, something seriously crazy happens. Reverend Jackie starts talking about the story of America, the old one that I was talking about just a minute ago. She basically says the same thing, talks about how America's story is broken, says we need a new one.
But I think our nation is built on a foundation of white supremacist, white nationalist violence. And I think the soil is rotten with this kind of enmity and brokenness, and that it infects all of us. Because it's not only in the soil, it's in the air that we breathe.
But Jackie goes on. She says love is the light that overcomes evil, that it's meteoric, oceanic, all-encompassing, defiant, bold, and brave. She talks about how love fueled the Southern freedom movement in the face of oppression, in the face of fire hoses and beatings and lynchings. She says she's tired. We're all tired. But God isn't tired. At some point, I find myself thinking about Sesame Street, thinking the Muppets would like this place, that Luis and Gordon and Maria would like it. Thinking I could bring Merge here, and Diane from the Bible Church upstate, and Tarzan, and Kevin and Priscilla from Texas. I'm pretty sure you could even bring Donald Trump here. And as long as he came willingly, he'd be welcome.
May it be so.
What you get focused to is what is ruling you. So get up off your knees, cry, help me please. You can help yourself, no matter how hopeless you've been. What I'm discovering, that God's been waiting on me, oh, he shall. Oh, we shall.
The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein and Robert Okendo produced the podcast. Lead sound direction and design by Eric Tortora Patu. Sound editing and design by Liz Maney and Eli Bronstein, with additional editing and design by Spencer Crosby. Fact-checking and research by Pamela Vu, and script editing by Samantha Story and Till Osterland. Additional research for the show was provided by Dana Lane and Reagan Eckley. Jessica Klepak is the creative supervisor, with graphic and website design supported by Emma Waters and Jennifer Von Glon. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The control variable is managed by Sean Madison. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.